welcome once again to the Lives of American Krishna. And on these lives, we go deep and deep and deep into the main text that I always quote on this channel, namely the Bhagavad Gita, the famous text spoken directly by Lord Krishna himself, allegedly self-declared to be the supreme person, God Almighty, as we say. So as I always recommend you guys to read the Bhagavad Gita as it is, there's hundreds of editions out there. The one by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, my spiritual grandfather, is the one that's most read in terms of numbers worldwide. And I definitely recommend you to read this one. It's available online for free. But as I say on this right now, we're doing a series. We've been doing it for several months where we go through the Bhagavad Gita study guide written by His Holiness H.D Goswami. Welcome to those who just came on live, and thanks for the thumbs up. We are reading the study guide by Dr. Resnick, Dr. Howard Resnick. I always like to say that I took this photograph in Paris about 6 years ago. He has a Ph.D. from Harvard in Sanskrit that he got faster than anyone in the history of Harvard University Indology and Sanskrit Studies Department. And he's a direct disciple of His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada, who gave him the name Hridayananda Das Goswami. So we are moving along with this chapter called Yagya, or sacrifice, one of the main themes of the Bhagavad Gita. So we are on the left page here, although Krishna urges us. And as you know, if you're here for the first time, every time we get to an actual verse, we'll click on it and we'll go to the actual reference. So although Krishna urges us to transcend this world by spiritual Yagya, so here, the point is, here's the conclusion. The conclusion is that in order to transcend material existence, you got to sacrifice for God selflessly. God will reciprocate in your life, both physical and spiritual, way more than you invest. So it's a good investment anyway. But the point is, spiritual yagya is what gets you out of the material world. Okay? Now, but Krishna is so cool. He's such a liberal kind of God that even though, as Dr. Resnick says here, even though Krishna urges us to transcend this world by spiritual yagya, he also explains worldly yagya or material yagya or sacrifice to help the reader become a good comparison shopper. Thus, the Gita presents the function, variety, and limits of mundane offerings. Now, if you've ever been to India, because India still today is probably the place on planet Earth where you see the act of sacrifice, of offering, probably most vividly compared to other places on planet Earth. But it's also the place where you can see this, you can really become, like Dr. Resnick says, a comparison shopper, in the sense that you see all sorts of worship of this god or this goddess with an explicit, it's openly, there's no shame about it, it's explicitly material. In other words, okay, I'm going to offer this sacrifice to this particular god or goddess, and in return, I'm not going to get pure love of God. I don't care about pure love of God. It's not even on the radar. What I'm going to get is a good wife or a good husband or a promotion or, entrance into my college of first choice, or I'll get more money, I'll get more power, I'll take birth on a better planet in my next life. All these type of selfish motivations. And it's just it's business. I scratch your back and you'll scratch mine. So continuing with the reading, Chapter 3 twice enjoins the worldly minded to participate through yagya, or sacrifice, in a kind of cosmic economy. So here, Krishna is going to describe in these verses that we're going to go to how this world actually functions. See, in the modern world, even including India, especially those who have disregarded Vedic culture altogether, what to speak of the West, especially the West that's not Christian, because Christians perform some sort of sacrifice, but because Christianity has become very much monotheistic without any type of acceptance of higher beings within the material world, as we see in early Christianity. There's definitely a cosmology that includes angels. Christians, to be fair, do believe in angels and stuff, but the cosmology that's described in the Vaishnava literatures gives a very detailed description of a very varied type of universe with planetary systems and all sorts of humanoid types of beings living on different planetary systems. It's super detailed. Whereas in biblical accounts, it's just you get a very nebulous understanding of who populates what in the universe and what the universe is about and what it's about, but what it is, or how does it look, or how it's structured. But here, coming to this point, Krishna 3 times in the Gita will show us how there's this sort of cosmic economy, when properly tended, brings prosperity to all. So how does success, or how does prosperity actually work in this world? In the first iteration of this duty, Krishna simply states that people must make offerings to cosmic managers, or devas, or gods and goddesses, who then supply all human needs. So here's the first point. There's a God, there's a Supreme Lord, and then there's his deputed agents, or deputed ministers, who are in charge of different areas of universal upkeep, and who give you and who give me our air, our water, our housing, our money, our clothes, you name it. It comes ultimately by God's grace, in reciprocation with our devotion, and especially our mundane piety or impiety, in the realm of physical benefits or physical sufferings. But they come through the via media, through the agency of what's called in Sanskrit the devas, the devatas or the devas, which I like to translate as gods and goddesses with a small g. Okay, the gods and goddesses. So let's go to these 3 verses, 3:10 to 13. Here, Krishna describes this cosmic economy. It actually starts, on 10. So here we go. Of old, bottom of the page, of old, the Lord of creatures, so Krishna speaking of himself here, of old, the Lord of creatures sent forth creatures, in other words, us, right, embodied souls, with sacrifice. So in other words, God creates a universe that has built into it this option of performing sacrifice. Therefore, I say we're ontologically built to perform sacrifice. So, of old, the Lord of creatures sent forth creatures with sacrifice and said, so Krishna is like speaking about himself. By this shall you flourish. So by this sacrifice, let this yield your chosen desires. And here's the point. Prosper the gods by this, and let the gods prosper you. Prospering one another, you will achieve the highest good. Prospered by sacrifice, the gods will certainly give you desired enjoyments. And here you see a little bit further at verse 16, Krishna says, a cycle is thus made to turn. You see, beings live from food. Food arises from rain. Rain comes from sacrifice. So you perform sacrifice, you get rain. Sacrifice arises from duty, and here we go. Therefore, there's a reciprocation. Prosper the gods by this, and let the gods prosper you. So this is how this economy works. So you want a nation to be successful, to be prosperous, at least offer sacrifices to the gods and goddesses. Of course, though, if you're monotheistic and you go directly to the emperor, to the supreme honcho, to God himself, then you don't need to go through this god or that god. That's why, in India, for example, where the Vaishnavas, the devotees of Krishna, those who follow Bhagavad Gita properly, I would say, try to convince regular Hindus who are not Vaishnavas, who are not, exclusive devotees of Krishna or Vishnu. The rhetoric is often, and rightfully so, listen, you don't need to offer this offering or that offering to Shiva or to Ganesh or to Parvati or to Kali or this or that, because if you worship Krishna, who declares himself to be Aham Adim Hi Devanam, he says in the 8th chapter, I think, or 9th chapter, I am the source of all the devas. Aham Adir Hi Devanam. There you go. Aham, I am. Adir, the original source. He, certainly, Devanam, of all the devas. I'm the source. I'm the origin. I'm the origin. So if you worship the origin, the original Supreme Lord, you don't need to offer worship to this or that. It's just like if you're in if you offer a bribe, or let's say you're friends with whatever, the emperor, then you don't really need, and you give him a large sum of money, you don't then need to separately, give money to this tax collector or that tax collector, because you've served the source, so to speak. So coming back to Dr. Resnick's point here, he continues by saying, With this bounty, humans then make further offerings that bring renewed bounty. We read those, a cycle. And this is a beautiful verse. Thus a cycle is made to turn. We saw that. A cycle is thus made to turn. A cycle. So there's a cycle. You offer to the gods and goddesses, they're happy, and you offer by doing a sacrifice on earth, they're happy, they give you rain and they give you crops and gold and And with part of, you use some of that to live, to survive, and so on, to enjoy in this world. And then with the surplus, you offer that back up to the gods and goddesses, and they're pleased by this sacrifice and they bestow more rain. And so in this way, there's a cycle, right? But ultimately, as Dr. Resnick very aptly points out at the very beginning of this passage, spiritual yagya, because this is mundane, this is just pious, but it's not spiritual, because the gods and goddesses are within the realm of matter, and they're just doing their service to God by basically maintaining a prison. They're in charge of maintaining the prison, where we are the prisoners. Where it gets really interesting is when we start offering to the Supreme Lord with love, with devotion. Now we're talking liberation. Now we're talking no more birth. Now we're talking experiencing a relationship with the Supreme Lord. Now we're talking intimate service to the personal form of God along with his feminine counterpart. Like it gets really, really esoteric. That's when Krishna or God becomes really happy. But until then, he's like, okay, guys, here's a system. You offer to my the deputed agents, and they'll give you what you need in this world. And when you get tired of that in this life, or after maybe 1,000,000 lifetimes, I'll always be here in your own heart, saying, okay, dude, are you ready now to love me with pure devotion? Because I love you. I love you with all my heart, as he himself says in the Gita in 1864 or 63. Ishto sime dridam, one of the most understated verses in the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna himself says, Ishto shime dridam, you are so loved by me. You are so much loved by me. So God loves us like crazy. He's just waiting for us to stop to first of all, stop ignoring him. And once we sort of acknowledge him, but don't pay attention to him because we're too concerned, making some pious offering to this or that god or goddess to get ahead materially, he's still like, okay, whatever. And finally, when we're like, you know what? All this stuff is not going to make me happy. Ultimately, I'm stuck in this repeated birth and death cycle, which ultimately ends in frustration, no matter how much money or how much sex or how much power or whatever I have, because I ultimately have to grow old and die, and no one can escape that. Let me surrender to you, my Lord. And that's when Krishna's like, okay, now we're entering into a relationship. Now it gets interesting. So, a cycle is thus made to turn. And so Dr. Resnick finishes, and we'll finish with this. Thus a cycle is made to turn, the cycle of receiving and giving back. If we do not keep this cycle turning, if we take but do not give back, then our heedless self-indulgence and ingratitude offend the natural order. We live in vain as thieves. And you see this in Western civilization. I mean, I would claim, and I'm sure a lot of similarly minded people would claim, that one of the reasons of the decline of Western civilization, is precisely because Westerners stopped being religious, stopped offering, monotheistic, loving sacrifice, however imperfect you may say, to the Supreme Lord or to the gods and goddesses. If they did at all, at least pre-Christianity, they used to. So then Christianity comes along, brings in, monotheism, which is great. And then you get these, some ugly stuff, shit happens. I'm sorry for the bad word, but, stuff happens everywhere. Welcome to the material world, including religious organizations. But Europe takes a direction of monotheism, of offering devotion to a Supreme Lord that Jesus supposedly represents, right? The Father, and he always talked about the Father and I are one, and so on. So you have this effervescence of monotheism. God's really pleased. Europe, shines forth. And then, First World War, whatever, Second World War. I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but you get to a state like today where there's this so-called egalitarian division between government and secular government and religious life, which basically is a justification to basically make religion disappear wholesale from society. That's another topic. To which degree do you include religious teachings in a democratic system, and especially if you have, for example, as in the case in Europe, a huge rise of Islam? If how do you then avoid Europe becoming completely devoured by Islamists and Europe becoming the new caliphate under Sharia law? Closing that parenthesis, though, the point is, when sacrifice to God stops, impiety sets in. Impiety sets in. Inauspiciousness sets in. And here, we'll finish with these actual verses. We'll go to 3:12 and 3:16, okay? 3:16, we saw that already. A cycle is made to turn. So at 3:12, let me get to the actual screen here. At 3:12, at 3:12, Krishna says, prospered by sacrifice, we saw that. The gods will certainly give you desired enjoyments. And then here, the one who enjoys these gifts without giving back to the givers is merely a thief. So you see, when you stop this cycle, when you receive all these blessings from the Lord and you stop showing gratitude, you stop acknowledging that it comes from you. That's why, I really like when, this is a small example, but it's meaningful. When you see these, sometimes you have these really pious, really religious athletes, and when they score a goal, or when they, score a touchdown, or when they, win the race, they'll point to the sky, right? And they'll be like, no, it's not me, it's God. Right? All the glory goes to God, because you're acknowledging that, hey, this victory, this opulence, this victory is coming from God ultimately. So that type of acknowledgement and gratitude is good. When you get all these gifts and then you say, and you never acknowledge God, and you start saying, yeah, it's because I really desired it, or I really wished it, and I really was, maybe you were really determined, and that's good, that's to your credit, but ultimately, if it wasn't for God's grace, you wouldn't have it. Like recently I saw, and I'll finish this, I saw this documentary called Becoming Led Zeppelin, a documentary on the famous group Led Zeppelin. And these are, they're still alive, except for John Bonham, the drummer, extremely accomplished musicians who became multi-millionaires, and, who are living up the good life, and who had tons of fame and glory, right? And instead, it's sad. Instead of saying, ultimately we got lucky, we got to thank God. No, it's all like, I had the right mindset. And I really think that if you really set your mind to your dreams, you'll accomplish it. Because, look, I did. But, maybe you had the karma for it. And what about thanking God in all of this? And not a blade of grass moves without God's sanction. So here's verse 16 from Led Zeppelin back to Krishna. One who does not keep this wheel turning, a sense enjoyer of errant life, lives in vain. And there's this beautiful song by Bob Marley, live for yourself and you will live in vain. Live for others and you will live again in the kingdom of Jah. So when you live for others, you're sacrificing for others. Ultimately, you're sacrificing for God. And when you do that, then you're living, then you will live with God. But if you live for yourself, you live in vain. Same thing here. Same words. Krishna says, one who does not keep this wheel, this cycle turning, a sense enjoyer of errant life. Like errant life means you have no direction. You're just like going from one sense pleasure to another sense pleasure until you die. You live in vain. You live in vain. So let us not live in vain, guys. Let us not live in vain. Let us continue serving God in this life. And the way to do it, at least according to the Bhakti tradition, is to chant Hare Krishna, to chant Krishna's holy name. That's the recommended sacrifice for this age. So you do it individually or you do it in a group. Okay, thank you for watching. I hope this was as pleasing to you as it was to me. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. And Hare Krishna. All glories to Prabhupada.
1, 2, 3, 4.